The year is 1914. Northern France is no longer a country. It is a construction site for an empire. The cobblestones of Lille, once vibrant with the scent of roasted coffee and the chatter of the textile mills, now echo with the rhythmic, metallic thud of the Pickelhaube, the iron-shod boots of the German occupier. To the generals in Berlin, Lille is a logistical node, a box to be checked, a population to be drained. They wrap the city in a shroud of barbed wire and bayonets, confident that no word will escape the perimeter. Within weeks, the city is a fortress of silence. But silence is not absence. In the smoldering ruins of the outskirts, where the smoke of the initial bombardment still clings to the shattered brickwork, Louise de Bettignies stands perfectly still. She is 34 years old, an aristocrat by birth, a governess by trade, and a ghost by necessity. She watches as the German war machine turns her home into a prison. She sees the way the sunlight glints off the new artillery batteries being dragged into the woods, monsters of Krupp steel that the British, just a few miles away, don't even know exist. She understands a fundamental truth that the men in the bunkers have forgotten. The bigger the system, the more it relies on what it chooses not to see. To the German sentries, she is a relic of a dying age, a petite, well-bred woman with downward cast eyes and a heavy wool coat. They see a victim of circumstance, a freie Fräulein, whose world of tea and silk has been rightfully replaced by the Order of the Reich. They do not see the observer. They do not see the mind that is currently memorizing the serial numbers on their supply wagons. Across the channel, the British military is flailing in the dark. Their maps are snapshots of yesterday, useless against a German army that moves like a liquid shadow under the cover of the French forests. The fatal flaw in their strategy is a reliance on the horizon. If the Royal Flying Corps cannot see it from 1,000 feet, it doesn't exist. But the Germans are digging in. They are burying their heavy batteries in the mud, hiding the steel throats of their guns where no pilot can find them. The British are sending men into a meat grinder because they cannot see the blade. Louise stands at a street corner, her breath a pale mist in the morning air. A German major, resplendent in polished leather and smelling of expensive tobacco, brushes past her, nearly knocking her into the gutter. He doesn't apologize. He doesn't even look back. To him, she is part of the scenery, no more significant than a lamppost or a paving stone. He assumes the silence of the city is the silence of defeat. "They are just sheep," the major tells his subordinate, gesturing to the crowds huddled in the bread lines. "They have forgotten how to speak. They have forgotten how to think. In 3 months, they will be grateful for the German bread." But Louise is translating that silence. She walks through the market, but she isn't looking at the meager piles of potatoes. She is watching the way the supply wagons lean under the weight of hidden shells. She counts the coal soot on the soldiers' uniforms to determine which railway line they use to arrive. She notes the specific color of the mud on the wheels of a passing ambulance, a chalky yellow that only exists 10 miles to the north, near a hidden crossroads, while the experts in London puzzle over grainy aerial photographs. Louise is walking the streets, turning the very arrogance of the occupiers into her greatest tactical weapon. She realizes that her invisibility is not a cage. It is a key. Because she was a traveler, fluent in 4 languages, and trained in the nuances of European high society, she sees the patterns the soldiers miss. She doesn't see a gray tide. She sees a machine with specific, vulnerable joints. She sees the Alice network before it even has a name, a group of women, children, and old men who are overlooked by the conquerors. The German command believed Lille was a locked room, its inhabitants too broken to resist. They treated the city like a conquered ledger, convinced that their iron grip had crushed the French spirit into submission. They believed that because they held the keys to the gates, they held the keys to the people's souls. But they had fatally underestimated the quiet air between the stones. Lille wasn't a prison, it was an incubator. While the Germans toasted to their impenetrable front, the first thread of a web was being spun right under their polished boots. They saw a woman in a tattered coat. They didn't see the architect of their eventual ruin. Louise moves toward the border, her pockets empty, but her mind overflowing with the coordinates of death. She knows that if she is caught, there will be no trial, no mercy, only a brick wall and a firing squad. Yet she walks on. The system thinks it has won because it has silenced the cannons. It has no idea that the most dangerous weapon in France is currently walking toward a checkpoint, disguised as a commoner with nowhere to go. The laughter of the German officers echoes in the cafes she once frequented. They mock the feeble French resistance. They ignore the warnings of the few who say the locals are too quiet. They prioritize the manual, the procedure, and the pride of the uniform over the reality of the human spirit. It is a mistake they will only realize when the British shells start landing with impossible precision, guided by a ghost they refuse to acknowledge. February, 1915. The winter air over the border between occupied France and neutral Holland doesn't just bite, it gnaws. It is a landscape of white and gray, where the only splashes of color are the coal-black barrels of Mauser rifles and the blood-red armbands of the Landsturm guards. At a freezing checkpoint near the Belgian frontier, the system is at its most formidable. The German army has constructed a death strip, a calculated expanse of electrified wire, tripwires, and sentry towers. To the military mind, this is a masterpiece of containment. The logic is simple. Nothing moves without a stamp, and nothing breathes without permission. Louise de Bettignies stands in the slush, a single figure against the iron machinery of the border. She is no longer the aristocrat of Lille. Today, she is Alice, a simple traveler with a tattered satchel and a pair of clicking knitting needles. The line moves with agonizing slowness. Behind her, a line of refugees shivers in the wind. In front of her stands a young corporal, his face hardened by the boredom of power. He is the personification of the obstacle, the man who believes that because he carries a rifle, he possesses the truth. "Destination?" he barks, not looking up from his ledger. "To visit my sick mother in the next village," Louise replies, her voice a fragile reed. She affects a slight tremble, the performance of a woman broken by the weight of the war. The corporal finally looks up. He sees a middle-aged woman in a drab shawl, her fingers dancing rhythmically with a ball of yarn. He scoffs, a sound of pure, crystallized hubris. To him, she is a domestic animal, a creature of the hearth who couldn't possibly understand the maps of empires. "You people and your knitting," he mutters, reaching for her papers. "The world is on fire, and you're worried about the warmth of a sweater. He doesn't realize that the sweater is a map. Inside that ball of yarn, Louise has pioneered a code that the German censors could never dream of. It is a symphony of stitches, a complex binary language of wool. A purl stitch represents a battery of field guns. A knit stitch signifies a troop concentration. A drop stitch marks a gap in the German line. Hidden within the loops of a simple garment are the precise GPS coordinates of the 20th century, the heavy batteries that are currently raining hell on the British trenches. The mechanism of her intelligence is as elegant as it is deadly. While the British military intelligence was obsessed with radio waves and telegraph systems, the Germans could easily tap. Louise turned to the ancient. She used the domestic to destroy the industrial. The corporal grabs the knitting, his rough, gloved hands fumbling with the delicate work. For a moment, time freezes. The steel screams in the distance, the sound of a train carrying reinforcements to the Ypres salient. If he pulls the wrong thread, the entire Alice network, now numbering over 80 agents, will unravel. "It's a gift," Louise whispers, her eyes wide with manufactured fear. "For a child," the corporal sneers, tossing the yarn back into her basket with a gesture of profound dismissal. He prioritizes his own boredom over his duty. He treats the domestic sphere as an irrelevance, a blind spot in the German surveillance net. "Pass," he says, waving her through. "But keep your eyes on the wool, woman. Don't look at the fortifications. They aren't for the likes of you." As Louise walks into the mist, her pace doesn't quicken, but her heart hammers against her ribs like a trapped bird. She has just carried enough information to destroy a German division past a man who thought she was a joke. While the German high command sat in their requisition chateaus, obsessing over the grand strategy, Louise was in the dark, building a ghost army. She recruited the invisible agents of Lille laundry women, who counted the patches on uniforms to track which units were being rotated out of the meat grinder. Schoolboys who spent their afternoons playing near the rail yards, memorizing the markings on the ammunition crates, and old men who sat on park benches, noting the exact time the officers finished their dinners. This was the Alice network. It wasn't a military organization. It was a community of the ignored. The yes, but of her mission was constant. Every time she successfully delivered a map to her British handlers in Folkestone, the Germans tightened the noose. They introduced dogs of war, trained hounds that could smell the ink on hidden papers. Louise's solution? She began writing her reports in lemon juice on the transparent wings of butterflies, or on the very skins of the onions in her grocery basket. Each solution created a new threat. The lemons were rationed, the butterflies were seasonal, but the arrogance of the system was her greatest ally. In the summer of 1915, the German governor of Lille, General von Heinrich, issued a decree. The population of Lille is a conquered body. They have no will but the German will. He believed his system of checkpoints and internal passports had rendered the city inert. He treated the silence of the streets as a sign of absolute control. He was wrong. While von Heinrich toasted to his perfect order, Louise was already in the shadows, holding the silence that would save the Allied front. She had discovered the location of a massive German long-range gun, a Paris gun prototype, hidden in a hollowed-out haystack. The British pilots had flown over it a dozen times, seeing only agriculture. Louise saw the physics. She noticed that the grass around the haystack was scorched, not by the sun, but by the backblast of a propellant. She saw the heavy ruts in the mud that no farm wagon could ever make. The black box of this intelligence was simple. The British knew the shells were coming, but they didn't know where from. Louise provided the input. The result was a British artillery strike that vaporized the haystack and the German crew within it before they could fire another round. The German response was not to question their own blindness, but to lash out at the obvious. They executed more men. They built higher walls. They never once suspected the woman with the knitting needles. But the hammer was coming. The German High Command scoffed at the reports of leaked information, believing their encryption was unbreakable. They treated the British artillery's newfound accuracy as a fluke, a statistical anomaly. They believed the French peasants were too stupid to understand the complexities of modern ballistics. They had fatally underestimated their opponent. It wasn't a fluke. It was a reckoning. It wasn't the work of a spy agency. It was the work of a woman who had been told she was nothing and decided to prove the world wrong. Yet, even as the Alice network grew to hundreds of agents, the strain began to show. The ghost in the machine was becoming too visible. The Germans were starting to realize that the leaks weren't coming from the sky, but from the ground. A new officer had arrived in Lille, a man named Conrad, a counterintelligence specialist who didn't believe in the invisibility of women. He didn't laugh at the knitting. He didn't scoff at the laundry. He began to watch the watchers. The silence that had protected Louise was beginning to feel less like a shield and more like a shroud. The deadly gap between her safety and her duty was narrowing. She knew the end was coming, but like a master weaver, she refused to drop a single stitch until the pattern was complete. September 1915. The luck of Alice finally runs out, not with a bang, but with the sound of a closing door. The German counterintelligence, led by the cold-eyed specialist Conrad, had finally stopped looking for a spy and started looking for an anomaly. He realized that wherever Louise de Bettignies went, the statistical fluke of Allied accuracy followed. She is arrested at a checkpoint near Tournai. There is no dramatic chase, no exchange of gunfire, just the heavy hand of a soldier on her shoulder and the realization that the system had finally widened its gaze. But even as she is led away, the Alice network does not die. She had built it like a living organism. It no longer needed its heart to keep breathing. The climax of her story takes place not on a battlefield, but in the sterile, suffocating silence of a military courtroom. The German officers sit in a row, a wall of medals and stiff collars. They look down at Louise, who appears even smaller, even more fragile in the dock. "You are a traitor to the administration," the prosecutor declares, his voice echoing off the cold stone. Louise looks him in the eye, the first time she has truly allowed a German officer to see the fire behind the decorative aristocrat. "I cannot be a traitor to an administration I never accepted," she replies. "I am a soldier, and soldiers do not betray their country." The irony is a jagged blade. The Germans, who prided themselves on the cult of the soldier, could not bring themselves to recognize her as one. To them, she was a franc-tireur, a common criminal. They sentenced her to death, a sentence later commuted to life in prison because the Kaiser feared the optics of executing a woman of her social standing so soon after the international outcry over Edith Cavell. They thought a prison cell would be her end. They thought the walls of Siegburg prison would swallow her name. For 3 years, Louise de Bettignies lived in a damp, unheated cell. The woman who had outsmarted the finest tactical minds in Berlin was now reduced to a number. The system tried to break her spirit through the slow erosion of the body. She was forced to work in the prison factory, producing parts for the very machines she had fought to destroy. But Louise maintained her resistance. She organized strikes among the prisoners. She refused to bow to the guards. She became the queen of spies, even in captivity, a legend whispered through the vents and pipes of the prison. The bitter victory arrived in the late summer of 1918. The German front was finally collapsing, pushed back by the very coordinates Louise had mapped 3 years prior. But Louise would not see the liberation. The years of damp stone and starvation had birthed a monster within her lungs. She died on September 27th, 1918, in a hospital in Cologne. She was 38 years old. The armistice, the silence she had sacrificed everything to achieve, was signed just 6 weeks later. As the world erupted in celebration, as the men in the high-collared uniforms took their bows and signed the treaties, Louise's name was already beginning to fade. The masculine narrative of the Great War had no room for a woman with a knitting needle. They wanted stories of trenches and tanks, not stories of sweaters and butterflies. The cruel irony is that while her intelligence had saved tens of thousands of British lives, the British military initially buried her contributions in the miscellaneous Magnus files. She was a civilian agent, a category that allowed the system to avoid giving her the full honors of a fallen warrior. But history has a way of leaking through the cracks. Today, if you visit Lille, you will find a statue of Louise. She isn't holding a sword. She isn't wearing a uniform. She is standing as she always did, unassuming, observant, and invisible to those who prioritize power over perception. The modern echo of Louise de Bettignies is a warning to our own era. We live in a world of massive systems, of algorithms, of global surveillance, of institutions that claim to see everything. We are told that the individual is powerless against the machine. We are told that the system is too big to fail and too complex to understand. But Louise reminds us that every system has a blind spot. Every machine is built on the assumption that certain people, the underdogs, the nobodies, don't matter. Do we see this same hubris in our society today? In the way we dismiss the voices of the marginalized? In the way we trust the black box of technology while ignoring the human truth right in front of us? Louise de Bettignies didn't have a radio. She didn't have a satellite. She had a pair of knitting needles and the courage to be seen as nothing. She proved that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't made of steel. It's made of the quiet, persistent refusal to be ignored. She was the thread that held back the iron might of an empire. And when the thread finally snapped, the empire fell with it. If you believe that stories like Louise de Bettignies deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing, like. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.